So this morning we're continuing here in Jonah, and this is a message that I was like, I don't know. I was kind of liking all the fun, exciting parts of Jonah, if you could call them more exciting. And I was like, man, this is a whole chapter on Jonah just praying, and I was like, this is heavy stuff. I mean, would you want to preach through a whole chapter? I'm going to try and do the whole chapter on Jonah praying. But you may wonder, like, what is the value in it? Like what are we trying to glean? And I would just like you to, bear with me, because I was like, I always find myself apologizing on a message like this, because if you don't care to see the deeper things, it can be a lot, and it can be really difficult to preach through. But I would like to tell you, there is amazing, profound promises in here from God that are crazy and like impactful and meaningful if you'll give them the time of day and the due diligence to hear them. And I just want you to be able to see how precious the promises are that are tied into the Old Testament. And I just hope that it does mean a lot to you. But so we're looking at Jonah here. And so it says in Jonah chapter 2, verse 1, it says that Jonah prayed to the Lord out of the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord in my distress, and he heard my cry. And he says, out of the belly of Shiloh I cried, and you heard my voice. So as we look at this, I want to point out a couple of things right away. And that is, what does Jonah mean? I cried out to God, or I cried out to the Lord out of the belly of Shiloh. Like he's in a fish in the bottom of the ocean. He's in the dark, deep corners of like just down in the blackness of the sea, right? And he says, I am calling to God from Shiloh. And what is Shiloh? Like, and I think this is important to you, because Shiloh is like, I would relate it to you as if you're familiar with Davy Jones's locker. Like, in a modern sense, and literally, this is literally kind of taken from this idea. But Shiloh throughout the Bible is called death and Hades in the pit, and it's pictured as this pit deep in the ground, or many times in the depths of the sea, in the darkest cracks of the sea, and it's like a box with bars and chains over the top of it. And when you're in that box, you're on the downside looking up. You're in the place of Shiloh. It's the place of not the land of the living, but of the dead. You're like the separated of what maybe you would call, this is dark, right? But maybe the underworld, okay? You are on the downside looking up if you're in Shiloh. So I want you to realize, like, as we're looking at the story, what have we gone through? We've gone through Jesus' life, his ministry. We've been seeing all these things in Jonah. And the last thing we saw was Jonah lifted up, as Christ was lifted up, thrown into the sea. What should we see? What would we be expecting? If Jonah was showing us the life of Jesus, what would we assume that maybe Jonah would pray in his prayer? What mysteries would we maybe be presuming would be revealed? And I would tell you, I believe we're seeing what it was like for Jesus to enter into death. Because he says, I am in what would be Shiloh, the pit, the death, the under the bars, the chains of death. And there's two reasons why I think that this is, it could be, I feel pretty confident in. Number one is that this is where it fit in the story, and this is how it would take place too, is the things he says. And another thing is, there's this distinct sound to when you hear in the Old Testament, when I believe you can kind of hear Jesus' death. And we hear this mostly in David's prayers, and not only do I sort of think I hear them, but the New Testament authors say, listen, some of these prayers, and they point to these words, and they say, this shows us what Jesus was going through. And I'm not going to take the time to show you all of them, because there's a lot of them. But I want to kind of read through a little bit of David praying, so that you can see a little bit of, oh, maybe that is just like Jonah. And maybe Jonah's living out like a picture of what it was like for Jesus to die, and what it was like for him to be in death. And that's a crazy thought, but I really think that's what we're seeing here, and it's a very profound thing. So I want to look at this here. And so first off, I just want to show you, and I'm going to read from a couple little blips of David's prayers that show us what I believe is the words of what Jesus would have felt in death. But with that, there's usually, I think everything I'm going to reference today, there is a New Testament author who points to it and says, yes, this really was what it was. But I'm just going to show you one of them for the sake of time. And in Acts 2:23, Peter is talking to the people who killed Jesus. And he says this. He says, this Jesus who was delivered up, he says, according to the divine plan and foreknowledge of God. And he says, who was killed at the hands of lawless men. So why does Peter think that God had this all planned? What makes Peter so confident that Jesus was going to come, they were going to grab him, they were going to kill him, and he was going to die and go into the ground and come back up again? Where does Peter get these ideas? And I want to tell you that he's getting them from the Old Testament. But Peter continues, he says, it was not possible for Jesus to be held by death. And then he gives the proof. And he quotes, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to jump right to where he's quoting from. It is in Psalm 16:10. And David is praying. And as David's praying, remember, this is David's prayer. But what does David say? David says, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. That is like the place, the pit, the death, the down there where Jonah says he is. And he says, nor will you let my body see corruption. And you're like, oh, maybe David's not going to be left in the pit. Maybe David is going to come up out of the pit. Or, Peter says, or maybe it's actually the words and thoughts of Jesus that were hidden in the prayers of David. And Peter gives evidence to this by saying, he says, brothers, I say to you with confidence that the patriarch David died and he was buried and his tomb, his grave is with us yet today. Peter is saying, this is the proof that it wasn't David at all. This is the evidence that in the prayer of David, we heard the death of Jesus and we heard the words of Jesus. But it was in David's prayer. It wasn't, he says, if David was not in Sheol, in the pit, in the death, in the place of separated from life, he says, then his tomb wouldn't be here. And he says this, he says, for he foresaw and spoke of the resurrection of Christ, that he would not abandon his soul to Hades, or let his flesh rot and deteriorate or see corruption. He says that David was praying, but he knew the future. And David prayed out the future. And we would have thought it was David speaking about David. But Peter says, think of it. Only one can fulfill this truly. There's only one who actually did this. So he says, if you apply a little bit of thought, you see it's probably not David. It's Jesus fulfilling this. So I want to show you that this is a pattern throughout David's prayers. That we're really hearing the voice of Jesus in the words of David many, many times. And I just want to kind of give you a little bit of insight into that idea. So listen to Jonah and listen to what Jonah says in his prayer. So in Jonah chapter 2, verse 3, Jonah continues. He says, you have cast me into the deep, into the heart of the sea. And remember that the Bible says that where Jesus was in the heart of the earth. He says for 3 days and 3 nights. As Jonah is 3 days and 3 nights. Well, this is really fitting that this would be the call of Jesus, or the feeling of him entering into death, into darkness, into the separation of the underworld. And so he says, you've cast me into the deep, in the sea, and it's the heart of the sea. And he says, the floods surround me and the waves pass over me. And he's like, I am down here, and I'm the downside looking up. And the waves are rolling over me above. And if this isn't enough of a picture of the death of Christ, I just want to show you, and what I think is cool is when I first read the prayer of Jonah, I was like, I think this is the words of Jesus. I think this is him entering to death, because this sounds so much like David praying. The sound of Jonah's prayer, to me, had the sound of David's prayer. And I was like, I'm going to check it out and see if I can find similarities between them two. But boy, did I find similarities. I was like, it's crazy the similarities I found. I want to show you in Psalm 69:1. David is praying, and again, David is praying the words of the feelings of the death of Jesus in his prayer. Although it is David, the New Testament also confirms that this is really, truly the foreknowledge of what would happen like 1,000 years later in Jesus as he's enduring this. And it says in Psalm 69:1, it says, save me, O Lord, for the waters are up to my neck. What? David's on dry land. Why is he talking about the waters being up to his neck? Because this is how the Old Testament people would envision entering into death. Like, the water's up to my neck. Does this sound like Jonah? Woo! The water's up to his neck. He's like, I am gonna die, right? The water, but David is merely describing the death of Jesus and what it felt like to slip below the surface to go to the under, okay? But David's just describing that feeling of Jesus in a prayer. He says, I sink in deep mire with no place for a foothold. So David is praying and he's like, death feels as though I'm on the surface and there's no place to catch it. Sounds like Jonah again, right? No place to catch his foot on anything to save him. He says, I have come, and this is David's prayer, still continuing. He says, I have come into deep waters. And he says, the floods sweep over me. Does this sound like Jonah or what? Jonah's like, I have gone down into the depths of the deep, and the floods, the waves are rolling over me. But David is praying the feeling of what it was like for Jesus to die. And I feel like that's exactly the description of what Jonah is living out. And this is why it just blows my mind. Of you're like, why did Jonah have to go out to sea? Why did this all have to take place? Why did he have to go through that? And the depths of the Old Testament is beyond insane. What can be put together in these stories, if you'll give it the light of day, will blow your mind. How much information can be entailed in a story that tells us so much about life and who Jesus would be. He says, David continues in Psalm 69, verse 3, he says, I am weary of crying out, and my throat is parched. And he says, my eyes grow dim from waiting for God. And you can just imagine Jonah as he's waiting for God. He's in the depths of the sea. He's down in the ocean, and this is very similar to David's prayer. And then David prays this. He says, more in numbers than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause, those who would seek to destroy me, who attack me with lies. This is what Jesus was going through. More than the hairs of his head were those who hated him without a cause, who sought to destroy him and brought up lies against him. But this is David's prayer, and he's describing the death of Jesus, as he would be like going under the water to death to look up as those who hate him were there. And he says this, and I want you to realize this, because this is going to be really important to tie into Jonah. David ends with this. He says, what I did not steal, must I now restore? If this is the death of Jesus, what does that mean? Must I pay for a wrong I did not commit, says David? What are we talking about? We're talking about Jesus, clearly. Who would be the innocent one? Who would die for a debt that he did not commit, for sin that was not his, for a payment that was not his to pay, but yet he'd gone under the waves, to the depths of the sea, to the heart of the earth, to pay for debt that did not belong to him, and it was recorded. And I want you to see in this message that in Jonah, I believe we're seeing one of the greatest promises. And as this plays out, this is a promise that was hidden in the Old Testament that you wouldn't see at first glance. But if you'll give it a little due diligence, you're like, whoa, there's a lot of promise here. There's a lot of words that only apply when Jesus comes and fulfills all of this. There's a lot of things that come to light when we look at this. So listen as we go back to Jonah in verse 4 of chapter 2, and listen to hear, if you hear, in Jonah's crying out, if you hear the words of Jesus in his death. Just listen very carefully, because I believe they're there. He says, I said, I am driven away from your sight. And he says, yet shall I again look upon your holy temple. And you're like, Jonah says, I'm driven away from your sight, but yet again, I will enter the holiness of God. I will again look upon your temple. And you just realize that in the Psalms and in Jesus Christ, we see that it is shown, that is clear, that in the time of Jesus taking the wrath of God and the suffering of death, that the Father would turn his face away from the Son, that he would bear a punishment that would separate him from the holiness of God, that in that moment he would be pressed away. And in Jonah's words, we hear the feelings of Jesus as he would enter into the death, into the grave, into the underworld, that he would be being pressed away from the holiness of God to bear the sin that wasn't his. And it's like, I don't know how much more perfectly you could describe such a thing, but have it so hidden, but yet so clear. And he continues on and he says, the waters close over me to take my life. Is Jonah dead or is he alive? I don't think it matters. People argue this, but I don't think it matters, because I think the words are to tell us that Jesus was very dead. Jesus did die. He went down to the heart of the earth, and he was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. And Jonah says, the waters pass over me, and they take my life. He says, the deep surrounds me, and the weeds wrap around my head. Why would Jonah say something like that? He's down there, and the deep is surrounding him. He goes down, and the weeds wrap round and round his head. And I think not only this was Jesus had weeds wrapped around his head and pounded into his head as he died in the crucifixion of the thorns, but also you remember in John 20 when Peter and John run to the tomb and they're looking because like Jesus is alive, what are you talking about? And they run in and they realize that Jesus is alive and he's on dry land and he's walking and living, and they look into the tomb and it says the strips of cloth that were wrapped about his head were laying there neatly. Jesus goes down into death, into the heart of the earth in like a spiritual sense. But his body is wrapped and his head is wrapped in these cloths. And I would say this is probably very much the feeling of Jesus' death. As Jonah says, I am down and deep and wrapped and tight, and they're wrapped round and round my head like strips of seaweed. But I think that we're seeing here what it was like for Jesus to enter into death for us. I think that Jonah is praying it out. And he says this, he goes down to the roots of the mountains. And he says, went down to the land whose bars closed over me forever. What is this? This is the pit. This is what would be called death and Hades, the pit where a bar of chains would collapse over you. This is the way they envisioned, or even the way the Old Testament would give us. How do you think about death? Like what could be your view of it? And although this is not, I don't think they mean for us to take it literal. I think they mean for us to have a grasp of how would you explain it. So they explain it as this. You go down to a pit with bars that shut on you, that you are dead and gone and you're separated from the land of living, the pit, the Hades, the death, the Sheol, it's like the box at the bottom of the sea whose bars shut over you. And that is what Jonah said he's in. But Jonah's merely in the belly of the fish. But Jonah says, I've gone down to that place and the bars have shut over me forever. That means death. Like you don't come up from the pit. You don't come up from there without a divine intervention of God. That is the place where you go to be gone. And Jonah says, I have reached that place in the roots of the mountains, down in the very depths of the bottom of the sea. He says, yet you brought my life up from the pit, my Lord. So this means that God has the power to remove someone, a soul, from the place of the gone, from the place of the bars, from the place where you don't come from. God can bring you back from that. And Jonah prays that out. And he says, you brought me up from the pit, my Lord and my God. And the pit, again, is almost always synonymous with the Old Testament, where it was like David prays, or someone prays, or there's this description, and it's like you go down to the pit where the bars shut on you, and that's the heart of the earth, the metaphor of the box under the sea, Davy Jones's locker, the dead place where nobody comes up from. And he says, and he uses that word in tying this in. So I want to look at one more prayer of David really, really quick, just to give you I always want to show you with proof so you don't take my word for it, that this is sort of the sound of the Old Testament. This is like the vibe of the Old Testament, that when you hear a prayer like this, you're like, whoa, there's divine promises and truth and reality to things that maybe would have just sounded like a pointless, wombling prayer just on the surface. But in Psalm 88:2, David again is praying. He's praying out the death of Jesus. He's praying out the pain of what it was like for Jesus to die. And in Psalm 88:2 it says, and I'm going to buzz right through the beginning of this really fast for the sake of time, but he says, let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. He says, for my soul is troubled and my life draws near to Sheol, the place of goner, right? And he says, I am counted among those who go down to the pit. And he says, I am man who has no strength, like those who are loosed among the dead, like the slain down to the grave. He says, those who are remembered no more, who are cut off from your hand. Like that is the place, right? That's the description. That's the pit, the Sheol, the grave, the death, the Hades, the bars, the locked, the done, the gone. And as David is describing what it was like for Jesus to die. And he says this, he says, in verse 6, he says, you have put me into the depths of the pit, in the regions of deep dark. That's down there. That's where Jonah is. He's in the regions of deep dark. He is and if you want a living, lived out example, what more could you ask of what it was like for Jesus to go into the death? Jonah is a man in the depths of the dark, of the crevices of the earth, down in the deep of the darkness, in the pit. And he says this, he says, in the regions of the dark, he says, your wrath lies heavy upon me, which is what Jesus is feeling. And what Jonah, he's taking a wrath or a punishment as he goes down to this depths, or at least Jesus certainly is. And he says, you overwhelm me with your waves, David says. Again, here he is, the box, the bottom of the sea, the waves roll over above, the chains, the bars, the lock, the captivity, the place of the dead. In the description of the place of the dead throughout the Old Testament is like that box at the bottom of the sea. It's the place of the gone, the place of the can't get out, the place of chains and bars. In the dark crevice of the heart of the earth, down there is the figurative picture that's given. And that couldn't be more in my mind what Jonah is going through. He is there in that place where he says the waves are rolling over him. So as you listen to kind of the end of Jonah here, and see if you hear who Jesus is. And he says in chapter 2, verse 7, he says, when my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord. And he says, and my prayer came up to you in your holy temple. And he says, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. So Jonah says this. Jonah says, listen, if you want out of the pit, do you want to stay down there? Is it anyone's dream that they look at life and they think, all that I aspire to, escaping the pit is not on my list. Like coming up from the place of the under to a glorified new life, that's not really on my list. He says, if you would put your hope into any vain idolatry, if you'll worship seek after any other thing, you've just sold your ticket to love of God. He says, you have forfeited what God offered. You wasted the escape of the hatch of the bars of death. He says, you forfeited it. You wasted it. You need to make a decision. If you're thinking about, do I want to be captive to the bars of Hades and death and Sheol, like I know it's just a description, but if you want to escape being captive to that darkness, he says, you must turn to the God that can escape you from it. Because anyone who turns to anything else forfeits being loved forever. And he says, this is a choice that you must make. So he says this. He says, kind of as we're wrapping this up to an end, he says, and this is crazy to me. This is one of the most powerful statements in this. Jonah says this. He says, but with a voice of thanksgiving, he says, I will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Who says that? That's an insane statement. Jonah's like, a sacrifice needs to be made. A promise was made, and I'm going to pay the price. I will pay I will pay to redeem from this grave. If a sacrifice must be made, I will fulfill the promise of making the sacrifice. Is this Jonah? Or is this the words of Jesus? Is this what he felt in his death and his dying agony and pain? That he said, if a sacrifice needs to be made, if the promise must be fulfilled, I'm here to pay that price. And I believe that we're seeing here the words of Jesus, and I want to show you in Hebrews 10:6, as the author of Hebrews writes the feelings of Jesus. And he says this, he says, in burnt offerings and sin offerings you have had no pleasure, but a body you have prepared. And he says, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. Jesus says the Old Testament laid out a promise. And we would say where, because you don't really see it, but we see it, don't we? It's there. It's in the words of David. It's in the prayer of Jonah. I promise I'll pay the price that you may escape the pit. I promise I'll pay the sacrifice that you may escape Sheol. And Jesus says this, as the Old Testament promised, if you take due diligence to read the pages and perceive the promise, he says, here I am. I'm here to pay that debt. I'm here to pay for that promise, that I would be the sacrifice, that anyone who trusts in me can escape that place. He says, I have come to fulfill those promises, and he did it. He did it. He died. He went through it. He went through the description that for hundreds and thousands of years was penned in the Old Testament, the promise of paying the debt. He says, here it is. Here I am. And he paid it. Now here we are 2,000 years later. Do you believe that if he came about 750 years after Jonah made the promise, and he came and he fulfilled the promise. He came in the flesh and he did it. For 3 days and 3 nights, he went to the pit, to the heart of the earth. He died, he paid the debt. Do you believe that he is coming back as he said he would? Are you going to make the choice to say, yes, I don't want to be in the pit. I don't want to be in Sheol. I don't want to be in death. I want someone who broke the chains to set me free. As Peter says, the chains could not hold him, the bars could not keep him. As the Old Testament showed us, so it was, and so he did, and so believe and be saved. And the last thing it says here in Jonah is that God spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah up on dry land. And there it is, the resurrection from the dead. That he lives, he walks as Jesus did. He's paid a debt as Jesus paid a debt. Although Jonah, in my mind, is clearly the living imagery of all that Jesus would do, there it is. Like, I don't know what more you would want. He showed us the divine promise of God, the divine fulfillment to break us loose from death. And he did it, and Jesus lived it out, and he paid it. And we can look, and thousands of years it was written down. All the promise penned secretly in these words that when you look at them with an open mind, I think is pretty clear what it was. And he did it for us. He defeated the grave. That place, call it Davy Jones' locker, is broken open for those who trust in Jesus Christ. If you make the decision to not sell your ticket for divine worship of all other things in this world, idolatry of all other things, if you will say, I'll choose Jesus, I'll follow Jesus, I will make him my choice, you'll not be left in Shiloh. You will not be under those bars because Jesus has set free and he has led a host of captives free. All those who put their faith in him. So let's just close here, and I just want you to know that this is a choice that you absolutely, it would seem foolhardy not to make. What a thing to waste. What a horrible, horrible thing to waste. And I just want you to know that you need to come to the point in your life where you're ready to make the decision. Divine idolatry or any other false promise, or that you'll choose to follow Jesus Christ with your life and be saved from that you make that choice, that you make that decision. Just know that I'm definitely always here to talk to, or anyone else on that decision, but I just hope that you'll not waste the insane offer that was given to you, and how I wish I could pass on to you the confidence I see in the Bible, that the divine Word of God, and how it's self-proving and impossibly true on so many angles and levels. Don't throw it away. Come to me or someone else and talk to me, or make sure you make that choice, your faith to follow in Jesus Christ. So let's close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, I just pray that you just help us to glean things from your word, Lord, although it may seem heavy and daunting. The words are profound, Lord. They're amazing, and they're prophetic, and they came about to be. They came to fruition. You fulfilled them. You proved them true. You proved them right. You conquered the grave. You released us from captivity, from the pit, from Shiloh, from death, from Hades, the place where we would be down and under, and separation from God. That you've broken that chain. That you've set those free who put their faith in you, who have trusted in you for the many years before you, and those who will follow after you. And we know that you're coming again, and that you will raise all who have put their faith and trust in you to live with you forever in glory. And I just pray that you just help no one to throw away the divine offer that you've given us of eternal life. And I just pray that you just help us to value this and to forsake all else to follow after you. And I pray this in your Son's name. Amen.